So as you know, these citywide gatherings are designed to focus on the things that we want to all be of one mind and one heart. For all the differences that we're going to develop in personality and in emphasis and in skills and gifts from congregation to congregation follows the way, there are some things that are very important that we are of one mind about. And I can think of only a few things that I would put in the same category with the communion of the Lord's Supper that are necessary for us to be of one mind about. So with all due gravity and emphasis, I want to begin. What I want to do, just so you know the arc of where we're going, I want to look at developing a biblical understanding of what God's doing in the Eucharist, and let's just start by explaining that word. Evcharisto in Greek, it means the giving of thanks. It's generally a word that was used by the early church about praying over a blessing of common bread and common wine to make it something different, to make it something more in the church than just common bread and common wine. So the thanksgiving, the giving of thanks, is what the Lord's Supper came to be known as. And so we use the word Eucharist as kind of a euphemism for the Lord's Supper. So I want to look at a New Testament and then an Old Testament development of where our ideas around the Eucharist are coming from. If we have time, I'd like to throw in a few early church citations. And then I want to talk about practical takeaways and how we're implementing those things among ourselves and why it matters. So let's dive right into John chapter 6. Turn with me there if you can. I feel like I don't have enough light. That's all the light we got, huh? John chapter 6. And we're going to start, I really wish I could read this whole chapter, but just for the sake of context, it starts with the feeding of the 5,000 with the little boy with his loaves and fishes. So that's like the backdrop. And then he goes across the sea, everybody shows up there, and he gives this teaching in John chapter 6. But remember, the backdrop is the feeding with the loaves and the fishes. So if we fast forward, we're going to look up to verse 26. Let's back up a little bit so we can see what they're talking about. When they have found him on the other side of the sea, in verse 25, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? And Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek me, not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. Now, I would encourage, if anything stimulates your heart or your mind tonight as we're talking about the Eucharist, do a study about bread and how bread is used in the Bible. It's what bread and water and tree and wood are the three kind of like archetypal concepts of the Bible. And you can trace the themes of wood and water and bread from the beginning to the end of the Bible, and they're all super significant and they're interrelated. So if this stimulates your heart and mind, go back through and look at what's happening with bread and how Jesus is playing with words here. How he's playing with the concept of the deliverance in Exodus, the manna in the wilderness, himself in relation to God's providence. There's so much here that we're not going to address. I'm just trying to focus on what's directly connected to how we understand the Eucharist. So keep that in mind. So he says, you came here because you ate bread. That's why you're looking for me. And were filled. And then in verse 27, labor not for the meat or the food. I'm reading the King James, so it uses meat. But labor not for the food which perishes, but for the food that endures unto everlasting life. Now watch as we read through John chapter 6 how bread and everlasting life are connected again and again, conceptually. Labor for that food which endures unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. Then said they unto him, What shall we do that we might work the works of God? And Jesus answered and said unto them, This is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent. And they said therefore unto him, What sign showest thou then, that we may see and believe thee? What dost thou work? What work do you do? Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father gave you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth life unto the world. Now, let's back up just a minute. It's an important concept. This is another instance where Old Testament, super important historical events are being used by Jesus to point to a picture of a principle and a concept that he wants us to understand. All of that drama and saga that Israel is playing out in the wilderness, that Israel is playing out through her kings, the saga of Israel is for our spiritual instruction. Physical things for our spiritual instruction. And this is laid out so clearly here. They say, hey, in the wilderness, God gave us bread from heaven that was manna. And he says, Moses didn't give you that. My Father did. And the bread from heaven is me. I'm the bread from heaven. I'm what it was really about. I'm what you were supposed to understand from that. There's a story going on there, and there was a point to that story, and I'm the point. He'll go on to make that clear. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth light unto the world. Then said they unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. They still don't get it, and I wouldn't have either. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. Like I am the way, the truth, the life. These I am statements, these are things that they show us what he is. He is the bread of life. This concept is picked up in the early church with no qualms. They talk about the bread of immortality. If we get a chance, we'll look at it. But he is sustenance. He is what gives life. The way that you keep going day to day, the way you put food in your body in order to consume calories so that the engine and machinery of your being can keep moving forward in space and time, he is that to you. The way that you have to have food to continue to exist, you have to have Christ in order to exist. He is an essential component to life. And not just theoretically. We'll deal with that more later. I am the bread of life, and he that cometh to me shall never hunger. And he that believeth on me shall never thirst. Woman at the well, evermore, give me that water. Where's this water that lasts forever? Where's this water that I drink and I never am thirsty again? It's him. It's him. All this stuff is him. He's the answer to these things. I'm the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. But I said unto you that ye also have seen me and believe not. All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. For I came down from heaven, just like the manna, not to do my own will, but the will of him that sent me. And this is the Father's will which hath sent me, that of all which he giveth me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. And this is the will of him that sent me, that every one which seeth the Son and believeth on him may have everlasting life. That everlasting life that's connected to bread. And I will raise him up at the last day. The Jews then murmured at him, because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven. And no wonder they should. Of course they murmured. And they said, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? Now let's look at responses here. And we're going to look more at responses as we go on. But when he says, I'm the bread of life, when he says, I'm the food that's necessary for your immortality, they are incredulous and scoffing and mocking and disbelieving. Keep those responses in mind as we move forward and listen to his teaching. Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then that he saith, I come down from heaven? Jesus therefore answered and said unto them, murmur not among yourselves. No man can come to me except the Father which has sent me draw him. And I will raise him up at the last day. It's written in the prophets, and they shall be all taught of God. Every man, therefore, that hath heard and hath learned of the Father cometh unto me. Not that any man hath seen the Father, save he which is of God. He hath seen the Father. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that believeth on me has everlasting life. I am that bread of life. Your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which cometh down from heaven, that a man may eat thereof and not die. I'm the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Okay, so up to this point, I can imagine all kinds of resolutions to understanding what Jesus means when he says, I'm the bread of life. That doesn't include concepts like the real presence. Let's explain that. Real presence is the idea that when we take part in the Eucharist, when we give that thanks, when we bless that common bread and that common cup, that there's something spiritual that happens among God's people and with God, that those things become more than the common elements that they were before they were blessed. That the act of the faith of God's people changes those things and makes them more than what they were. That Jesus' real presence inhabits the bread and the wine that we use in the Eucharist. So up to this point, it could be ethereal. He could just be talking about conceptually, I'm the bread, or we just have to meditate on him and chew him in our minds and all these things. Those are all, you can understand why people come at that up to this point. But let's see where he goes from here. He says, I am that bread, and I'm going to give my life. The Jews, therefore, strove among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So what do the people listening to him think of what he says? They think he really means it, right? They think he means this, whatever this guy's saying, he's talking about giving us his flesh to eat, and that's crazy. That's what they understand him to be meaning. And they think that's crazy. Then Jesus said unto them, verily, verily, I say unto you, he does not back down. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoso eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is meat indeed. That expression, indeed, is an important expression. Because you can have things one of two ways. They can be in word, or they can be in deed. They can be in concept, or they can be in reality. They can be figurative or literal. The expression indeed means in action, in reality, in substance. That's what I'm talking to you. My flesh is meat indeed. My flesh is food indeed, in a real way. And my blood is drink indeed. He that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood dwelleth in me, and I in him, as the living Father has sent me, and I live by the Father. So he that eateth me, even he shall live by me. This is that bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers did eat manna and are dead. He that eateth of this bread shall live forever. That's pretty intense. Let's go on. These things said he in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum, and many therefore of his disciples, when they had heard this, said, this is a hard saying, who can hear it? Now, this jogs my memory because I look for these things when in Jesus' teachings. The things that weird people out, the things that Jesus says and people are like, that's too much. It's important that we focus on those places because if we too would be inclined to say, that's too much. So we want to draw in there. We want to think of those times, these hard sayings. The other thing that immediately jumps in my mind when I read through this is Matthew 19. When he says that in the beginning it was not so, for he created them male and female, and whatsoever God has joined together, let not men put asunder. In later, the disciples are like, wow, did you really mean that? And Peter says, if this is the case with marriage, then we shouldn't get married. Like, this is too much. Peter's already married when he says that. This is too much. Maybe we shouldn't get married then if it's this serious. And Jesus says that to whom it is given, some are born eunuchs and some are made eunuchs and some will be made eunuchs for the kingdom of God. And that's another time when Jesus says something and everybody's like, I don't know about that. And when I talk to people about divorce and marriage or any of the other hard, or non-resistance, or any of the hard sayings of Jesus, what we often do is we say, listen, hold on. Pay attention to what Jesus is saying and take him at face value. Believe what he says. Engage with him as if he has the power to say those things and mean them. And I would advocate that if we do that with his teaching about loving your enemies, and if we do that with his teaching about the durable nature of marriage and the importance of it, then we should do it with his teaching about his flesh and his blood as well. That these things all run in a vein. And that what's interesting to me is that this teaching, by and large, is just as scandalous in the 21st century as it was in the first. That when we have teachings like this, when we have conversations like this, when we talk to people and we say, hey, Jesus meant exactly what he said, people are like, no. That can't be. That cannot be what he means. And those words echo through all of Jesus' hard saying today just like they did then. That can't be. It can be. It can be. And there's not just reason, there's good reason for us to believe and practice that Jesus meant exactly what he said here. That his flesh is meat indeed, and that his blood is drink indeed. So let's just follow it out because we're this close. This is a hard saying, who can hear it? When Jesus knew in himself that his disciples murmured at it, he said unto them, does this offend you? What if you shall see the Son of Man ascend up where he was before? It's the Spirit that quickens. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. But there are some of you that believe not. For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not and who should betray him. And he said, therefore said I unto you that no man can come unto me except it were given of him of my Father. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. This is a divisive teaching. This will separate people who will let Jesus say things that seem incredulous and follow him anyhow. Because it's exactly how the disciples receive him. Many people could not make it through Jesus' teaching in regards to this. Then said Jesus unto the 12, will you also go away? And Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life, and we believe and are sure that thou art that Christ, that anointed one, that Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered them, have not I chosen you 12, and one of you is a devil? He spoke of Judas. I know that the logical or polemical value of gauging these responses is relatively low, but it's very important to me to see in the scriptures how people react to what Jesus says. And where they're prone to reactions, we are prone to reactions. And we need to watch and see what a faithful reaction to Jesus' hard teachings is and what an unfaithful reaction to Jesus' hard teachings are. The faithful reaction is, I may not understand that. That may not make sense to me, but you have the right to mess with my ideas. You have the right to reshape how I think about things, how I think about important things. And I don't think that we can, it's hard to be too critical of these Jews here. Because you have to think about where they're coming from when they receive this teaching. These are Jews who for all of their history, all of their oral history have been told, no blood, no blood. Nah, and forget about people, animals. Don't touch the blood. Don't drink the blood. The blood is not for you. That's what pagans do. That's what devils do. That's nothing. Your inheritance is not in that. If you want to be mine, if you want to be my particular people, you're going to distinguish yourself by separating yourself from blood. It's something we don't do. Death and blood are connected in their minds for generations. And it's not like they made it up. It's literally from the oracles of God. And to walk into an encounter with Jesus, this kind of wild healer man from Nazareth, who all of a sudden is going against everything they know about what God has taught them and their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers and their great-great-grandfathers all the way back to Moses, is standing in opposition to what Messiah is saying in front of them. And they have to weigh that whole package of belief with Jesus. And I think in comparison to that, we have it pretty easy. To be able to just say, Jesus said flesh and blood, it's flesh and blood. I'm not going to leave it there. We'll talk more about that. But we need to consider all those things. It's important after you read John 6, because I think there are many people who carry through John 6 this ethereal idea about Jesus' conversation about bread and his identity as the bread of heaven. So flip with me to Matthew 26. And let's let Jesus explain to us exactly what he meant. In Matthew 26, in verse 26, it says, "And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, 'Drink ye all of it, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of the fruit of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.'" So Jesus says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, and then he says, take, eat, this is my flesh, take, drink, this is my blood. That's pretty clear. Like, that was pretty gracious of him to put that kind of postscript on his teaching in John 6 and say, just in case you didn't pick it up, this is what I was talking about. This is my flesh, this is my blood. Eat it, drink it. So we have to connect what he does in the institution of the Lord's Supper with what he teaches in John chapter 6. This is an yeah. Let's jump forward to 1 Corinthians 11. I don't have the time. Okay. Wow. I'm going to skip 1 Corinthians. And I hate to do that. You all know 1 Corinthians. I'm going to trust you with that. We've read it a million times. What's important to recognize there is the consequence of what Paul's admonishing the church about. That to come to the Eucharist unworthy is to be made guilty of what Jesus said it was, the body and the blood. You're trampling over that thing which was sacred. And you're abusing these desperately important things that were given to the church by Jesus in the institution of the Lord's Supper. And the consequences associated with it are a highlighting of how serious Jesus was in allowing people to walk away from him over this teaching. It's just a reiteration of the severity with which the apostles are receiving Jesus' teaching about how we're approaching this thing called communion, this thing called the Eucharist, that it's some of the strongest language that's used in the New Testament, that you're eating and drinking damnation to yourself. And that can't be underemphasized. There's only a few things that are like that in the whole New Testament, where you're just literally consuming damnation. You're swallowing down God's wrath and judgment. And that's not something we ever want to do. So, I was talking with Dean one time, and I don't know if you use this in your preaching or not, but he talks about the sacrament. Let's explain that word too. Sacrament is a Latin word for mystery. It just means there are things about this that are more than meets the eye. It's typically referred to the things, the ordinances of the church that do something outside of the physical. So baptism, marriage, and the Eucharist, some others, anointing of oil. But there's more than meets the eye. That's what your mind should say when you hear the word sacrament. More than meets the eye. It's a good way to think of it. And it's kind of hard for a lot of people to deal with communion if we're raised our whole lives saying it's just a thing we do. It's just like a remembrance. It's just like a memento, like a flag. It's just a marker to say something happened here. There's nothing more than that happening. Solo memoriam, only memory. And that's a lot of us grew up that way, and a lot of us think that way about these things in spite of what Jesus says about them, in spite of what Paul says about them. But Dean told me one time when we were talking about this, he said, no one thinks that if you live next to some Satanists and they were having some black mass in their house, and in order to be a good neighbor and a good witness, you would go over to their house and visit with your Satanist neighbors, and there they are partaking of their unholy sacraments, and you would just sit at their table and partake with them, or go into some pagan temple and worship some false god, that wouldn't have an impact on you, that wouldn't affect your life and your being and who and what you are. We know that intrinsically. Like, that makes sense. But we think we can sit at Jesus' table and partake of holy sacraments and righteous things, the things of God, Jesus himself, his blood and his body, and that's somehow just a memory. Doesn't have any real impact in our lives. Doesn't really affect us or change us. Okay, I am going to go to 1 Corinthians, but I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians 5, just quick to read this to make some connections. So 1 Corinthians 11, eating and drinking damnation, we're reiterating how important this is. But 1 Corinthians 5 is interesting to me. In 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 6, look what he says here. Your glorying is not good. Know you not that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Does everybody know what he's talking about here? You make some bread, you mix your dough, your flour, and your water, and your eggs, whatever. You put some yeast in there, and you mix it together, everything in there. All the bowl is now leavened. It works its way through the whole lump. That's the point to putting it in there. The point of putting a little yeast in your dough is that the whole dough gets affected. Everything touches everything. There's not a part of the dough that gets leavened and part of it that doesn't. If you put yeast in there, the whole lump gets leavened. That's the point. And he's playing with these same kind of themes. He says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Verse 7, purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. Now remember, we'll look at it here in a minute, before the Passover is what? The Feast of Unleavened Bread. Purge the leaven out of your house for 7 days, no leaven, then the Passover. So he's drawing on all this history, all this teaching, all this parable, all this example. And he says, put out that old leaven, that you may be a new lump as ye are unleavened, for even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, keep the Passover, not with the old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So he expects the Corinthians to understand what he's talking about in drawing on these types and analogies from the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover. He wants to connect the life of the church and later the communion of the church with these Passover types. And that's important. Let's flip back there to Exodus chapter 12 and look at what's happening at the Passover. This is the original institution of the Passover, and I'm gonna sketch for you. There's 7 days of unleavened bread. It's commanded, and if you partake of, if you're in Israel and you partake of leaven during that 7 days, you're done. No mercy. There's no tolerance for leaven during this feast. And we know from Paul what leaven is supposed to mean. So listen, brothers and sisters, I'm going to fast forward and give us some takeaways right here. This is the attitude that you're supposed to have when you come to Agape on Sunday. No leaven. It is not allowed. Leaven equals death at the communion of the Lord Jesus. And during the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, they would take, this is where Western civilization gets spring cleaning from. Did you know that? This is where our concept of spring cleaning comes from. Because the Jews would take all the furniture out of the house, out the front door, take everything out, and sweep all the corners, make sure everything was clean, go through the pantry, rout out anything that's leavened, because it's so serious. I don't want to lose my identity. I don't want to lose my life. I don't want to lose my connection to who I am as one of God's people. I don't want to lose God's grace and favor. I don't want to be polluting the people of Israel. I don't want to be the cause for downfall. And I'll go to whatever lengths it takes to clean the house. And that's how you have to come to the church on Sunday when you meet with us to have communion of the Lord's table. Your job is to make sure that your house is clean, that you show up and you're not bringing sin. You're not bringing leaven. You're not bringing malice and covetousness and unrighteousness into God's house. These are important concepts and important practices. 7 days, a whole period, from Sunday to Sunday, from Sabbath to Sabbath, a whole period, a complete part of life. No leaven. And we meet weekly. You got a week. Clean your house. And keep it clean. That's what we're doing there. This isn't, so we make these little breads, in our congregations, and we bless them and we pray over them. But you got to stop and think. There's a reason for why this is. It's not just because we don't like fluffy bread on Sunday. We're telling ourselves something. We're clean. When you take that unleavened bread, when you sisters bake that unleavened bread for the church, and you bring it in on a plate, and you set it before the church, and we pray and consecrate that bread, and we make it holy, you're saying, we're clean. We're holy. We've cleaned the house. We're right. On day 1 and 7, there's a holy convocation during the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and there's no work to be done. These are consecrating ideas. You're set apart. This isn't common. You're not a commoner. You're something important. You're something special. You're something separate. Set apart from the rest of the world. Just this one tiny little tribe of people in Palestine, they stop everything. Because we're God's. We belong to him. We're his chosen people. He wanted us to be his own. These are the things that we're carrying forward. When Paul tells us, his churches, to keep not the feast with the old leaven, this is what he's talking about. That we're coming to the church and our house is clean and we're separated unto God. We're his own special people. Set apart. And in verse 25, I'm not going to read it, but in verse 25, he tells them why. He tells them this isn't just once, but you're going to do this every year. You're going to do this in this month, in this season, at this time, on this day. You're going to mark this time because I want you to remember. I don't want you to remember how the lamb tastes. I don't want you to remember the blood. I want you to remember that this is what it took to set you free. This is a remembrance of how you were delivered and how you were brought out of Pharaoh's house and into mine. How you were poor, broken, neglected, beaten, abused, and oppressed slaves. And I set you free with this cost to be my own. And every Sunday when we as the church pray over these things and partake in these things, don't neglect to remember. This is how we got free. We too were poor, abused, broken, neglected slaves, but not to Pharaoh, to the devil himself. And our king and our champion and our hero bought us out, gave himself up, poured out his blood, and we got to walk out free, spoiling the enemy. Remember. Remember. Not just remember for yourself, but show your children. I want them to remember too. They weren't there, he says. And my children, many of them, they don't know what my deliverance looks like. They don't know how I got free, but it's my job to show them the marks of remembrance. This is how your father and your mother were set free. We have our own exodus. We came out too. And Sunday by Sunday, when we meet with the church of God and we do sacred, holy things, I want my children to know and to remember their father was set free. There was a price for my freedom, and I was bound in captivity. I was a slave. And now I'm a king and a priest. Look at 12:43. This I want to focus on. And the Lord said unto Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. There shall no stranger eat thereof. No strangers. But every man's servant that is bought for money, when thou hast circumcised him, then shall he eat thereof. A foreigner and a hired servant shall not eat thereof. In one house shall it be eaten. Thou shalt not carry forth aught of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall ye break a bone thereof. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as one that is born in the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. One law shall be to him that is homeborn, and unto the strangers that sojourn among you. Thus did all the children of Israel as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. So in the ordinance, the original ordinance of the Passover, there's some important concepts that are happening. This is not a temple feast. This is at home. This is for the entire nation of Israel. I didn't pull out the references, but if you don't partake of Passover, you're not in Israel. You don't belong. You're not one of the people. If you don't have Passover, this isn't your people. It's for the entire nation. Everyone's supposed to do it. It's so important. I think it's it's at the end of Exodus. It's so important that some people were really bothered because they were unclean from touching a dead body, and they couldn't keep the Passover. They were in this conflict, this religious dilemma. I'm unclean, I can't go to the Passover, but I can't miss the Passover. And they're so bothered by it, they go to Moses and they say, hey, what are we supposed to do? There's a do-over day to make sure that everybody gets the Passover. This is essential to the identity. Because if you're not partaking of the Passover, you're not in the people that are remembering the deliverance, that are staying in continuity with God's deliverance from Egypt. You're out of step with God's deliverance. So there's a do-over. It has to be done. It's essential, just like Jesus says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you shall not inherit eternal life. It's necessary for all of his people, but it's done from house to house. That's important. That's important conceptually, because this thing is something that's universal and very individual. It's discrete and unique. It happens from house to house. Only those who are circumcised. Only those who are circumcised. Now, this feast that we're supposed to have, let's put ourselves back in Moses' day. This feast that we're supposed to have, only circumcised people can come. But you know, the Old Testament advocates, I don't know how faithful the people were to it, but it advocates a very hospitable attitude towards strangers and travelers and sojourners. It's an important spiritual concept. So you're supposed to be welcoming to anyone who's traveling through, to anyone who's coming through, people maybe from afar. You're supposed to welcome them in. But when it comes to this time, if they're going to have this meal with you, it's your obligation as the father of the home to make sure about one of the most intimate aspects of a person's being. It's your job to know whether the men at that table are circumcised. And that is not a polite conversation. Imagine being in that place. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread is going on, and somebody's traveling through town, and you're faithful to God. You're one of Jehovah's people. I want to make sure and do my part. I want to represent the grace that we were neglected as God's people. I want to extend hospitality, the goodness of who we are. So come to my home. Come and eat with me. Come and sup with me. Come and sit at my table. Bring your sons. I'll care for you. Now, before we eat, there's some things I need to know. That's a very intimate conversation. This is speaking to the level of intimacy that those who are sitting at this table share. I don't have time for that. Let's talk about some takeaways, because we need to get to conclusions here. One thing that's important to me about this, and this is a very brief sketch, as you all know. There's so much. We could have a lot of meetings to discuss the details of what the scriptures are teaching about this particular practice and ordinance. So I don't mean to gloss over any of the details, but we have to get to some conclusions. And one of the conclusions for me for a long time has been that this is one of the few important things that separates us with a very clear line from our Anabaptist brothers and sisters that we love and respect. And if you're struggling with whether or not, because I've talked to people and they say, well, I don't think that's inconsistent or impossible within. It is. At least on paper, the teaching of the Anabaptist revival, all the way back. Sattler specifically repudiates the idea of real presence in his defense. before he's put to death. It's all throughout the Anabaptist writings that are specifically repudiating this idea. Now, that being said, if I was a 16th century man, I would want to have been in line with the Anabaptists. I understand why they were at that place. I understand why they were making those conclusions. But I'm not a 16th century man. I'm a 21st century man, and I have my own blindnesses and missing things that I don't even know that I'm missing, and I don't need to borrow them from another era. This teaching is not consistent with the Bible, that the Anabaptists teach that communion is just a solo memoriam. It's just a memory. It doesn't create grace in the people. It doesn't include the real presence of Jesus in the elements of the bread and the wine. And that's a line of separation. In fact, Ignatius would have called it Gnostic. Those who didn't believe that Jesus was in the elements of the bread and the blood, he put in the camp of Gnostics. There again, that's very historically, contextually important. There's a lot of things why he said that. You can't just leave it as a blanket statement. But the fact remains that we don't have to be beholden to those errors. We can clearly say, Jesus taught these things, the church believed these things, Jesus is in the elements. His presence is with us when we bless and consecrate the bread and the wine. He's there. We're partaking in a real way of his body and his blood. The same author, I think in the same work, who says that it's Gnostic not to believe in Jesus' presence in the elements, also says that we believe in two natures, a physical nature and a spiritual nature. So in the physical nature it's bread, in the spiritual nature it's Christ's flesh. In the physical nature it's wine, in the spiritual nature it's his blood. So the two can be together. So that's one thing. Another thing, it is very important to me, and it has been to followers of the way since we began. One of the important concepts of how we meet is that the reason that we call the church together is to sit at the Lord's table with Christ at the head. It is the reason for the convocation. The reason for all of us gathering together into one place on the Lord's Day is specifically to celebrate the Eucharist. That is the reason we come together. Now, why does that matter, Matthew? Because intentions matter. Because in many other places, the reason to come together is to hear Jeremy or Dean or Zach or Matthew or Finney or somebody talk about the Bible. And I love that. I love listening to our people talk about the Bible. It's one of my favorite things to do below communion. The important reason that we gather Sunday by Sunday is specifically to sit around Jesus' table with him at the head, for him to lead and guide and direct his people, for him to call us together, to put us under his wing, to purify our hearts, to sanctify us, and to recommit, for us to recommit to each other, to him to us, for all of us to be together and to be made one with him at his table is our reason for being together. And that's a different motivation. Because when I'm thinking through the week about coming to Sunday, I'm not wondering what text he's going to preach from. I'm wondering, how is my life in accord with Jesus' purpose for us being together on Sunday? That's the reason we come together. And while we're together, we do these other things. But the reason we come together on Sunday is to celebrate Jesus' table. There are certain things, prescriptions that God has made for us that make us healthy. The reason it's important that we keep our focus on our Sunday gatherings, the reason it's important to keep our focus on being at the Eucharist, to being at the Lord's table together, is because it's healthy for us. You know, another example is the Holy Kiss. The Holy Kiss is not a relic from the past. It's not just an old custom that we keep alive. There's a reason for it. There's a reason to greet your brother with a holy kiss. There's a reason for you ladies to greet your sisters with a holy kiss, because you're all very familiar with the gospel narrative. And when you lean forward to greet your brother on his cheek, if you have malice in your heart towards him, you cannot help but feel like Judas. A kiss is an important thing in the gospel narrative. It's the betrayal. It's the mark of the betrayer. And to have an impure heart and to kiss somebody is to betray them. And the reason we practice the holy kiss is because we want an inner witness. When you have bad feelings towards your brother, you can't help. When you lean forward and he greets you and you greet him and you feel that, ugh, that's you betraying your brother. That's you being Judas. That's you being the adversary. That's you creating all the problems. Can't have that stuff. You got to fix that. And that kiss, that physical thing that we do, is the reminder. It's the constant, make sure it's all caught up. Make sure, here, I want to make sure that you're not betraying your brothers. I want to make sure that your heart is right. I want you to be close enough to each other. I want you to be intimate enough with each other that you feel like Judas if you see each other and walk away with malice in your heart. And there's similar concepts happening with our agape. When we sit down at a table and when we share bread together, who shares bread together? I mean, think back to the history of mankind. Who shares bread together? People in your tribe, people in your family, people in your house. When you share bread, when you share food, that means you and me are sitting at the same table. You and me are part of the same people. You and me are one. That's what sharing your food means. You and me are one. And so we share a meal. And we talk and we laugh and we cry and we love and we share. And we share not just the food. We share our life. We share our thoughts. We share our insecurities. We share our sins. And we share our hopes. We share everything. The food is just the physical conduit for all of that. And as we share our lives together and as we sit around that table, there comes a time when we bless that bread. And all these things about the unleavened bread, about consecration, about no sin, about no leaven, about eating and drinking damnation, about judging those within and not those without, all this stuff comes flooding and churning through us as in our midst, in our hearts and our minds. How am I right? Am I caught up? Am I current? If things clean, is the house swept? Am I faithful? Am I in love with my brothers? Am I right with God? All these things begin to churn as we begin to talk about this is the point. When we sit around the agape table and we begin to be honest and be open, it's not, I don't want to just know how your appointments went this week. I don't want to know if you talked to Granny on the phone. I want to know, are you right? Are you healthy? Are you whole? Are you functioning? Are you broken? You can be broken with me. I can be broken with you. That's the place where I can be broken. That's the place where I can come to my people and say, it's not working. I'm not well. I'm hurting. Things aren't going real well right now. And I need to share it with you. I need to tell you. I need you to understand because I need help. I need you to pray for me. I need you to watch for me. I need you to lift me up. That's the place for that. This is why when I say, when people come around and they don't know what happens behind that closed door, and they come to our meetings and we have good meetings and it's nice time, it's fellowship afterwards, I always want to plead with them. You don't know what it's really like. You don't know what you're missing. The real stuff already happened. This is just dessert. You just came for the dessert course. Because the real stuff happened before. The real stuff happened where we actually could be family. Don't lose that, brothers and sisters. We have a lot of work to do to be better at that. We have a lot of work to do to be real. I've been here for 6 years and trying to figure out, how do we get real? How do we defy the convention of all of our lives where we're supposed to put on some air and some face and be something when we come around God's people. How do we break that? Because that's the enemy. That's not truth. And I don't know. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to create an environment and relationships where people will do that. Because we don't do it to ourselves very well. Who knows their own self? I mean, it's hard enough to figure out what your own problems are. I just know I have problems. I can't even understand them sometimes. And then to get outside of yourself and to bring that to people and say, here's who I am. Here's who I'm understanding me to be. Here's what I'm seeing that isn't working and isn't right and I don't know how to fix and just doesn't fit with who I want to be. That's the real line. If you show up on Sunday with your brothers and sisters and you're being who you want to be instead of who you really are, you're missing, not just for yourself, but for the church, for the people of God, what he's trying to create in our midst through the Eucharist. And just like our teachings about loving your enemies, this is uncommon and unnatural. It is the spiritual man who will prioritize honesty, prioritize who he really is over who he wants to be. I want to be a lot of things, not just for selfish reasons. I want to be a lot of things for you. I want to be a lot of things for my wife and for my children and for my neighbors. And I want to be a lot of things. But there's some difference in different categories between who I want to be and who I really am. And I want you all to know who I really am, not just who I want to be. So, if that's our goal, and if that's what we're doing, then you can understand why this is a selective audience of people. Why not just everybody comes to that meeting. Why this is a place for family. Why this is a place for people who are really intimately committed and connected to one another. That's why this Passover is rooted in a home. Because we as brothers and sisters are supposed to be acting like a family sitting at a table. And you know what the family table is like. You know how sometimes it includes training and rebuke and laughing and rejoicing and encouraging and admonishing and teaching. And all kinds of things happen at the family table. It's for family. Get your elbows off the table. Don't you know how to be civilized? That's the kind of stuff that happens at the family table. Sometimes that's necessary. Training and admonishment and checking in and accountability and all those things happen at your family tables. And they're supposed to be happening at God's family table too. That family concept makes it clear to me in the Passover and in the New Testament passages and the applications that the question of who do I have communion with is not just a question of who is a Christian who I don't know is walking in sin. Because the question of the Passover is not just who is a Jew. It's not even just who is circumcised, but who is circumcised that's connected to this house. Certainly you have to be circumcised to be in the Passover, but you also have to be connected to that home because it's a family affair. It's where we are connected to one another in purpose, in understanding, in commitment, all these things. So it's been our practice here in the church that when someone comes around and we begin to start developing a relationship with them, that we have a process that we go through. And we've just learned by experience that because those are our ideals, because we want our agape and communion time to be that intimate expression of family life and honest sincerity, we want to bring people into that from a perspective of relationship. That you don't just show up at that meeting, you don't just come to that place in a maybe category. Well, let's see if this fits me or not. We want to establish a relationship with people and then bring them in. And there's a process that we do that through. We have a spiritual assessment. It's kind of a clunky term for a list of things that we want to talk to people about. And while I'm on that subject, let's just make that real clear that the spiritual assessment we do isn't tantamount to a list of extra biblical standards. In other words, it's not a checklist that we go through and say, do you believe this? Yes. Do you believe this? Yes. Do you believe this? Yes. Will you do this? Yes. Will you not do this? Yes. That's not what we're doing. When we sit down with someone and when we go through a spiritual assessment, there's all kinds of questions that there's all kinds of answers to. The purpose and the intention, as you brothers, as the churches grow and all of you brothers get opportunities to go through this with somebody, the intention is to have conversations about these important topics. We ask on the spiritual assessment if you struggle with depression. That's not because if you answer yes, you don't get to come into communion. It's because if you answer yes, we want to understand where that's coming from and how we can love you and support you and be a part of that struggle with you in your life. I want to know that before you show up. I want to know what's important to you. I want to know what's out of place, what you need help and support with. I want to know those things of those that I'm sitting at Jesus' table with. Because it's not just because it's a responsibility. Because when we sit together at that table and we bless that bread and we bless that cup and we pass it around, we're committing to each other the same way that we're committing to God. We're saying you and I are one people together, and it's our job to work together to build God's idea to build God's logos for humanity, to build the things that God wants people to be. The reason he created us, the purpose for the creation is our interest. We're working together in the tiniest ways and the grandest ways to create God's desire for humanity. And if we're going to take that serious, then we need to really know who we're laboring with. We need to know how to help each other and how to love each other and where to step in and where to step back. So that's the purpose of our spiritual assessment, in having important conversations with people. And some of those things are things that we really do want to make sure that people understand about the gospel and understand about the scriptures, so that we can start from that place and build together. If you have questions about that, there's plenty of us you can talk to. We also, in line with the instructions in Exodus, we make a provision for sojourners. The Eucharist is so important to life and health that there is a way to bring a sojourner into our agape and communion. I've already described what an intimate affair it is, and so it's not like you just want anybody showing up there when I've had a rough couple months and I'm just bleeding and needing to talk. You don't want just any Tom, Dick, or Harry in that meeting. But there is a way to bring somebody who's a known character, who's known by somebody in the church to be faithful. But there's a few provisions for that. The assumption of bringing a stranger in, not a stranger, a sojourner into one of our agapes is that he's a known quantity somewhere. That he has his own home that he's normally a part of, but he's away from there. He's traveling through, and it's good to connect. Here's the reason I think that this sojourner principle is important. It's good to connect the churches. To say that we are all one people. If you're traveling through and you're known, before Dean came, when David Brousseau comes out, when people that we know, old friends that we've churched with, we know their lives, we know they're faithful, we know they're connected, we know they have a testimony and an established connection somewhere, and they happen to be with us instead, then we can bring them. But it's important also that it's temporary. You know, if that person was to move here, then we need to have some conversations about what does life look like, and how are we going to mesh together, and how are we going to join ourselves up, and how are we going to make connections that need to be in place for us to be in communion every week. That has an old pedigree. Actually, Paul mentions it. I believe Paul mentions it in 2 Corinthians 3. He says, need to be letters of commendation to you or from you. That's not a direct quote, but that's what he's talking about. He's like, we're your apostle. I don't need a letter of communication. Right? He says that because there were letters of communication, where if you were traveling, you would take a letter from your bishop, and when you showed up in a new place, when you were from Rome and you showed up in Corinth, you'd say, hey, I'm so-and-so. I'm a Christian. I love Jesus. Here's my letter from my bishop, so you know who I am and where I'm coming from, and if you have any questions, let me know. And that's how you would come into the church and from place to place. But Paul's saying, I don't need that. I'm your apostle. It'd be like me going to Africa for a few years and coming back here and needing a letter from the African church to commune here. You'd all be like, we know Matthew. He's been here. He's one of our brothers. I want to address the idea that comes along with this teaching sometimes, that these are overly narrow prescriptions. That either this constitutes some kind of judgmental attitude or superior attitude. And I think there's some important cautions in regards to that. I think we want to make sure that we have an ear and a critical eye towards ourselves and how we are relating to people who are in different places geographically and with some other things. I think it's worthwhile considering, we want to have open hearts, and we want to be able to have conversations and evaluate our positions and the biblical nature that they're based on. But the problem with a more open style of communion is that I actually don't believe it's loving to the person or to the church. It feels good. It's nice to have an open hand and just say, hey, if you're a Christian and you're not in some sin that I know about, then come into the church. There's a certain kind of sensibility to that, would that you were all one as I and the Father am one, and unity in the church and one church and all these things. And there's plenty of concepts to ground that kind of idea and thinking in. But the problem is in the practice. Because practically, if you have people in your communion that you don't know, they're subject to real damnation. Like, this is really, really serious stuff. I can't overemphasize, this is really, really serious stuff. To enter into the Lord's Supper is to be at risk. Because if you do this wrong, the consequences are dire. And I think that God grounding the Passover and the communion in intimate gatherings is meant to stave that danger off, to make it as least likely as possible. That people are known and understood when they sit at that table. That there's somebody that can call them out. That somebody can say, what about this last Thursday when I saw this thing? Or what about how come things aren't working? Or the same problem's going on now for 6 months and there's no traction. What about that? And somebody to help get people over the problems that would make communion dangerous to them. So it's not loving to those people to just have carte blanche communion. The other thing is it's not loving because in many instances it can encourage a rootlessness and a disconnected kind of like wandering Christian mentality where it's not necessary or important to ground yourself in a group of people, where it's not important because you can go have communion hither and yon. It's not important to really get known by a group of people who can look at your life. And it encourages, and I know that there are some cases where that wouldn't be the case, but there are enough that it's worth mentioning the concern that to have open communion encourages people not to get rooted and grounded with a group of people that they can be family with. And they lose out on all that potential blessing that we were talking about. They lose out on that intimacy, on that grounding, on that real openness and understanding of one another. And I don't think that's good to do to people. It hurts the church because it hinders our ability to be open. When you have strange people around, you don't have those kind of conversations. You have hey, how's it going, and who are you, and where are you from, and what do you believe about this, and did you hear about that? And it's not what we're looking for. So it's not good for the church, and it's not good for the individual. There's some other reasons, but I'm way past time. The last thing towards that point, though, that I'd like to share is that whenever I'm challenged on that question, is the church overly narrow? Is followers of the way overly narrow in regards to their communion? I don't always say it, but I always think it. Who did Jesus have communion with? There are hundreds of people listening to him, thousands of people following him. He said, with desire, I have desired to have this meal with you. 12 people. 12 special people in his life sat around a table and had the most intimate experience they could have this side of death. That's important to me. I'm just going to pray and close this meeting. It'd be nice if we could sing a song. Do we want to do questions? Do we have time for that? I always feel like I'm overrunning the clock. Y'all want to do some questions? All right, let's do some questions. Then we'll pray. Who has a question?
All of your comments. So I certainly would agree with you made a lot of excellent points in your message here. That I think the modern Anabaptists have gone the swingly and symbolic way. But I would say there's an excellent book on this by the Remembrance. I'm going to maybe we should actually have a copy of it. It looks at the early Anabaptists, and it does three groups. And Phillips was probably somewhere in between. But interesting, even Mena was probably a little bit in between. And with Sadler, I just don't know that we know.
You don't think his discourse with at the diet makes it clear?
I think the challenge that we have is that it seems like the early Anabaptists were arguing that the locus of transformation was the people of God, not the elements themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so in that polemic back and forth with the Roman Catholics, that we're arguing the focus is on the bread, becoming muscle and hemoglobin and
Mm-hmm. The transubstantiation position.
yeah, which is a straight transubstantiation. Which is not getting to my question, which is how do you differentiate real presence from
Yeah.
a transubstantiation? Because a lot of people, don't get the difference.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important difference.
I want to put a place marker there on your question about Anabaptist theology. Anabaptism in outline discusses this to some degree, and Anabaptism, especially in its early days, is obviously an emerging movement, and so there's a lot of transition happening from, especially somebody like Menno who's coming from Rome. Where do you pick? When is he talking about it? These things are important. I think where they end up is clear enough. I would tend to think that Sattler's pretty clear, but I'm not willing to say that none of them had a variance of opinion. But in regards to the question of transubstantiation and real presence, these are. Well, let me read you what Irenaeus says, because I think it's the best. It's the best commentary on it. Our opinion is in accordance with the Eucharist, and in turn the Eucharist establishes our opinion, for we offer to him his own, announcing consistently the fellowship and union of the flesh and spirit. For the bread, which is produced from the earth, when it receives the invocation of God, is no longer common bread, but the Eucharist, consisting of two realities, earthly and heavenly. So also our bodies, when they receive the Eucharist, are no longer corruptible, having the hope of the resurrection to eternity. So that two realities is the important concept of real presence. So the Catholic position of transubstantiation is that regardless of how it tastes or what you perceive, what you sense about the Eucharist, when the priest blesses the element, it literally becomes, it like recreates into the atoms of Jesus' body that were here on earth. And even though it may taste like bread, what you're actually consuming, and this is something they propose by faith, is that you are ingesting the literal flesh, the physical flesh of Jesus. And real presence is in line with what Irenaeus shares there, that there are two realities. And so the distinction is important because it's a middle ground position. Real presence is a middle ground position. Transubstantiation says, check your brain at the door. It's really like the atoms that were composed of Jesus' body recreated for you right here, right now. They're often, it's the sacrifice of the Eucharist is what it's often called. And on the other end, it's just, there's nothing happening. There's nothing happening in the mysterious. There's nothing, it's just, we're just having bread. And a lot of what I've read about the Anabaptists and why I tend towards that position for them is that what's important to the Anabaptists, many of them, is that what God's conveying in the Eucharist is not this supernatural divine manifestation that creates grace in people's lives, but the sharing of bread. That the brothers sharing their bread is what God's after, and it's a quasi-Quaker position. Like the Quakers take it to the next step, and they say it doesn't matter if you have bread or not, as long as you share stuff, then you're having communion together. But it's one step removed for that for some of them who are saying what's really important about the communion is the brothers are sharing the bread. That this is fellowship and intimacy and all the commonality that we associate with sharing bread. And that's really what they're grounding their ideas and theology around the Eucharist in, as opposed to the transubstantiation position of Rome. So the other thing is about real presence, how it's a middle ground, is that we're saying that in the same way, so the Eucharist, the bread and the wine are in a real sense the body and the blood of Christ, in the same way that Jesus is in a real sense the good shepherd or the light of the world. Those things are not just figurative. It's not like he's not really a shepherd, even though that doesn't mean that in Palestine he was walking around with a shepherd's hook on the hillside. But he is in a real sense a shepherd. He is shepherding his people. He's really leading them like a shepherd leads sheep. And in the same kind of sense, Jesus is the light of the world. It doesn't mean that he's necessarily luminous, although he does become on the mount, but that he is showing how he is bringing light into people's lives so they can see how to go. So those kinds of real things that Jesus is, but not physical things that Jesus is, are how we understand communion to be happening. That it is really bread and wine, and it is really the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. Does that make sense? At least in as sacramental a way as we can grab a hold of it. Any other questions? Those are good questions.
I read something by Justin Martyr, I think,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about making a provision for the sojourner.
Mm-hmm.
And they would withhold the Eucharist if the person didn't believe that what the things that they taught were true. So somebody we're friends with, we consider family,
Mm-hmm.
but they are at a different place on some teachings that we hold to here.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that?
So belief is a spectrum, and the importance of belief is a spectrum. Jesus talks about the weightier matters of the law. Some things do matter more than others. And I think that's a That's something that the church has to build out of consensus, what's on which side of the line. And it may be that it has to be assessed individually. Because someone who doesn't believe something like me, but is on a path and a journey, is different than someone who has encountered it, engaged, interacted with it, and purposefully rejected it. So there's a lot of objective and subjective criteria that have to be analyzed to answer that question with any kind of accuracy. But it's conversations that we should be having when they come up as a brotherhood to figure out where those lines get drawn. I would say, too, secondarily, the way people live is also an important consideration, not just what they believe. Brother.
Yeah, thank you very much, brother, for what you shared here today. And yeah, I would see the end of that just a little differently. I don't want to get lost in that. But one of the things that I've always been impressed with is a quote I heard from John Wesley, actually.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about this. He says that the sacrament is not just a confirming sacrament, which it is.
Mm-hmm.
It is also a converting sacrament. Meaning that, when we partake of this, there is in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
There is this grace-giving power.
Yes.
Ignatius gives the medicine of immortality,
Mm-hmm.
concept to this. And that incredible joy that you have with that is awesome. A kind of rule of thumb that I have when I speak of all the ordinances
Yeah.
is the word merely
Mm-hmm.
and that ordinance should never be in the same
Mm-hmm.
sentence.
Amen.
So, I see modern American evangelicalism a step further than Zwingli.
Mm-hmm.
Zwingli, I can almost see Zwingli, even though I'm more towards Luther even than Zwingli on this consubstantiation subject, but even he at least saw a divine influence in the ordinance. Nowadays, you're right, it's a divine absence. It's we just do this for obedience, we just do this, and I think that's a whole degree that even the Reformation they would have never argued on.
Yeah.
Any of those camps. But yeah, it's such a powerful and beautiful teaching of what Jesus gave us. And I think it's a very exciting thing.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, well, why don't we give thanks together? Why don't you all stand and we'll pray.